Well, welcome to the 700 Club. Iran is world famous for exporting terror, and now they're exporting thousands of deadly drones to Russia. The Russians are unleashing them on Ukrainian civilians, terrorizing the population.
The White House says Iranian troops are also on the ground helping Russian forces. Iran's complicity with Russia's war on Ukraine has serious implications for Israel and the United States. Chris Mitchell reports from Jerusalem.
This is the aftermath of one of the many Russian attacks against Ukraine using Iranian-made drones. While Russia denies Iran is supplying it with drones, the Pentagon disagrees.
What that means, obviously, again, we continue to see Iran be complicit in terms of exporting terror, not only in the Middle East region, but now also to Ukraine.
These drones are, about as big as a person or two people, so they're not huge, and they carry a warhead, and the warhead can basically be used to slam into something. Now, in the case of the Russians, they're using this to basically terrorize civilians by attacking apartment complexes and going after the power grid and stuff.
Seth Frantzman, author of the book Drone Wars, warns Iran has become expert in drone technology and that Israel will likely face these kinds of Iranian-made drones.
I think clearly in any future war, we'll see that drones will be flying at Israel and attacking Israel from Iran, Iraq, maybe even from Yemen, and also, of course, from Syria and Lebanon. This is a way for Iran to extend the front line against Israel to a 4,000-mile front line. And that makes it more complicated to interdict and stop them and predict them and detect them.
But for Europe, the future is now.
These are Iranian rockets which are coming to Russia and going to be launched on European soil. They're going to kill European citizens, European energy infrastructure. It's well past time for the Europeans to actually start doing something.
Noronha and Frantzman say the way the government of Iran is cracking down on the protests in its streets and this unholy alliance between Iran and Russia are a wake-up call to the West.
They're starting to realize that Iran doesn't share their interests and that Iran doesn't want peace and cooperation with the West. So it's sort of this common realization of just how dangerous Iran has been.
Finally, the West is waking up and saying, you know what, this is really not a regime that we can deal with. And the fact the Iranians are working with the Russians, and now the Iranians are terrorizing Ukrainian civilians with the drones, I think really everyone is saying, no, this regime is just awful, and we cannot ignore how bad it is anymore. And I think that's a big shift.
But the question remains, will Iran pay any consequences for its alliance with Russia? Right now, it's up to the U.S. and Europe. Gordon?
Well, Chris, what can the U.S. and Europe do to stop Iran from supplying drones and missiles to Russia?
Well, a few things they can do, Gordon. First of all, they can go to the UN and they can return what the UN sanctions had been. They were lifted in 2015. They could put those on again. Europe, for example, can impose an arms embargo on Iran. They had one from 2006 to 2020, but they let that expire. They could also ensure that the ballistic missile ban that is set to expire a year from now would continue. Now, one of the biggest things they could do, Gordon, actually, is they put the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, on the terror organization list. They could sanction members of the IRGC. And actually, Gordon, they could also allow some of the planes that are carrying the drones to Russia, that they're also being used to fly commercially to European capitals. They could try to stop those flights.
Well, how does this affect the ongoing nuclear talks? The Biden administration wants to revive the nuclear deal with Iran. Is that still on the table, or is that going to now go away?
Well, right now, the White House, and I think a lot of people are glad to hear this, they've set the nuclear talks aside for the time being. Why? For one, they said that the Iranians are on the ground helping Crimea, helping the Russians to use those drones against Ukrainian targets, including the capital of Kyiv. And then they're lying about it. Iran's supply of drones to Russia and all of this are making it very hard for the Biden administration to continue those nuclear talks. Now, remember, Gordon, we've talked about it a lot. Those talks are going to give billions of dollars in sanctions relief to Iran. And what's more, U.S. is concerned Russia may try to get not only these drones, but surface-to-surface missiles from Iran to use against Ukraine. So these nuclear talks are facing a lot of headwinds. And it's good news, bad news. The bad news, Iran is actively assisting Russia in the war against Ukraine. But the good news for those that are concerned about the Iranian nuclear deal, that the U.S. won't be able to agree to this deal, at least under these current circumstances.
It has to be humiliating for Russia to go to Iran and say, we need your missiles. We've run out of missiles. We don't have enough to conduct this war. And you know, so we need your drone technology and we need your missiles. Is Russia acknowledging that they have an ongoing problem with this war?
Well, I don't think they're admitting it. About when we talked to Seth Fransman earlier about that drone wars, he said, you know, Russia, this is the country that brought Sputnik. They have a sophisticated nuclear program. They have lots of sophisticated weapon systems, but they're turning to Iran, which is really, an expert and a world leader in drones. But it is kind of humiliating for this superpower, presumably, to go ahead and get Iran from these relatively simple drones that are basically suicide drones going into apartment complexes or some of the electrical grid. But it's certainly a downgrade for Russia.
Well, Israel is being caught in the middle between Russia and the West. And now Ukraine is asking Israel for Iron Dome weapons, air defense system. Is Israel going to supply Ukraine with those? What's Israel's response?
Well, right now they're saying they won't supply those kind of weapons. For Israel, they are in the middle. It's a complicated and delicate geopolitical situation for them. They stand with Ukraine. They've come out, pretty straightforward. But they also don't want to alienate Russia. And the reason for that is they, in effect, share a border with Russia on the Syrian-Israeli border, since Russia controls much of what goes on in Syria. And Israel needs Russia's help to stop Iran's military advances inside Syria. So on the one hand, Ukraine is asking for military aid, and particularly, as he said, those Iron Dome and air defense systems. And since Israel has some of the most sophisticated systems in the world, but so far they've just given humanitarian aid, not going to give the military aid. Just the other day, Defense Minister Benny Gantz said they'll not give any of those air defense systems. And Gordon, in a rare instance of unity, former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who you interviewed just the other day, he said that the current government is being prudent and circumspect by not selling weapons to Ukraine. And he says he fears those weapons supplied on the battlefield could end up actually in Iranian hands and then be used against Israel.
Well, let's talk about the Bible. Is there anything in Bible prophecy that would show that there's a coming alliance between Russia and Iran that would then turn against Israel?
Well, it does talk in Ezekiel about an alliance with the country from the north as well as Persia, or modern-day Iran, getting together against Israel. So prophecy people that are studying this certainly look to both Ezekiel chapter 38 and 39 as a possible prelude to what's going to happen. And they look at the current events right now, this growing alliance between Russia and Iran. When you look at that through the lens of biblical prophecy, you really do see this kind of alliance lining up with what the prophet Ezekiel said about 2,500 years ago.
All right. Well, Chris, thanks for the insight, and let's continue to pray for the peace of Jerusalem. In other news, hospital beds are filling up with children across the country, all because of an alarming increase in respiratory illnesses. Ephraim Graham has that story from the CBN newsroom. Ephraim?
Gordon, more than 70% of children's hospital beds in the United States are full because of this surge in these children's diseases. The number of new cases is growing so quickly in at least 36 states, many hospitals are overwhelmed. The sharp rise in these respiratory illnesses includes one known as RSV, which can cause mild cold-like symptoms and in severe cases can lead to pneumonia. The increase in the number of patients has been so strong, Connecticut Children's Hospital has had to treat some patients in its hallways. And its healthcare team is working with FEMA and the National Guard to find a location for a mobile field hospital. Turning overseas now to Britain, the former leader Boris Johnson is among the favorites to return as prime minister in elections next week after Prime Minister Liz Truss unexpectedly resigned Thursday. Dale Hurd has that story.
One of America's closest allies needs a new prime minister, and its Conservative Party intends to choose one within a week.
The three favorites are former Treasury Chief Rishi Sunak,
House of Commons leader Penny Mordaunt, and former Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who was forced to resign by the party just over 3 months ago after becoming mired in scandals. Now it's a sprint to replace Liz Truss as the leader of the party in the country. Truss quit Thursday after a turbulent 45-day term, having lost support of the party. The next prime minister will be Britain's third in just 8 weeks, bringing joking comparisons to the short-lived governments of Italy. Dr. Glenn Dewar, professor of international studies at Cedarville University, thinks Rishi Sunak could be Britain's next leader.
He served as the Chancellor of the Exchequer, that is the finance minister, usually the second most powerful person in the United Kingdom. Hypothetically, Boris Johnson could come back to the position of prime minister, and he has a massive mandate.
Johnson, who remained in the parliament after stepping down as prime minister, has not said whether he'll run. Dewar says outgoing Prime Minister Liz Truss had a good plan for helping Britain, which, like the U.S., faces high inflation and a weak economy along with an energy crisis. But he says her mistake was backing down.
Truss's major error was reversing. Thatcher had the famous line of the ladies not for turning, and when Truss did turn, it really divided the Conservative Party, and a lot of her major supporters then turned on her as well.
Truss wanted to strengthen Britain's economy by cutting taxes, but she was viewed by some in her own party as too radical.
The government has looked like libertarian jihadists and treated the whole country as kind of laboratory mice in which to carry out kind of ultra free market experiments.
The abrupt change in government is unsettling for some citizens in one of the world's most stable democracies.
You know, everything just went up in the air, so I just feel like the country's lost, and it's terrible, terrible feeling, isn't it?
Yeah, and we don't know where we're going now, what's going to happen.
Yeah.
Conservative Party nominations are to be completed Monday, and a new prime minister will be chosen by next Friday. Dale Hurd, CBN News.
Truss's historically short term lasted only 45 days. Gordon?
Well, the number of prime ministers in Great Britain's history, the number of changeovers since they voted to leave the European Union has been absolutely extraordinary. And when you hear people on the street in London saying, we've lost our country, I think as Christians, as citizens of the world, if you will, we need to take a giant step back and look at what's happening politically, where the stable democracies can't seem to get it together to actually have a government. They seem to be so focused on campaigning and getting elected that they can't then focus on governing. So Great Britain, it's historic to see this, a 45-day prime minister, and then the toss-up of who's going to lead going forward, and whoever takes that, there's not going to be a unified country behind them saying we have to come together because we've got some major issues to solve. Their economy, their market, the English pound was in disarray. I've never seen the English pound get to parity with the U.S. dollar. I never thought it would happen. It's the first time since the dollar was invented with the American Revolution. It's absolutely incredible to see it. But we're not seeing it just in Britain, and don't think this is isolated. Brazil has a very important election coming up. Israel has a very important election coming up. We in the United States have a very important election coming up. But my prayer is, after the elections, can we come together and realize democracy is worth it? Bastions of liberty are worth it? Can we put aside our differences and say, can we come together? Later in this program, we're going to be praying for America and join with us, but we need to be praying for these democracies. We're talking about the leading democracies of the world with the leading economies of the world. If these things fall, chaos will result. We need to understand this should not happen on our watch. We have to pray and ask God to intervene.